Welcome to this presentation of Music, Merriment, and the Mayflower, sponsored by the Alden House Historic Site during this holiday season. My name is Desiree Mobed, and I'm the Executive Director. Together with the Alden Kindred and its Board of Directors, we preserve and share the legacy of Mayflower passengers John and Priscilla Alden and their homestead in Duxbury, Massachusetts. As we mark the 400th anniversary of the Mayflower reaching Plymouth Harbor, musicians from the group 7 Times Salt will take us back in time through this virtual lecture and demonstration to share the music of the Pilgrim era. Through these tunes that were popular in the theaters, taverns, at dances, for worship, and even in Holland, we get to know the world of the Pilgrims a little better. 7 Times Salt specializes in performing 16th and 17th century music around New England for the past 17 years. After the presentation, we encourage you to type your questions into the question and answer function on your screen. If you have to leave early or you'd like to share a recording of this program with others, a recording will be available on the Alden website. And now we'd like to welcome Dan and Karen.
Thank you so much, Desiree, and hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to join you today. While Dan gets our presentation ready, I'll just tell you a little bit about our group and how we got interested in music from this time period. As Desiree mentioned, we are a group of musicians. I'm the violinist for 7 Times Salt, and we're based in Boston. Today, Dan and I are going to take a look at some of the music that we imagine the settlers of early Plymouth might have heard, might have sung and played themselves, and what it might have meant to them. We're going to follow them from the turbulent England of the 1590s to religious freedom in the Netherlands, and then on to their new lives in New England in 1620. So years and years ago, I worked at Plymouth Plantation as a historical interpreter. I wore a costume and learned to speak and cook and garden as English people probably did 400 years ago. I also got to sing catches and psalms and part songs, and I got to dance to 17th century tunes. The whole experience was a lot of work, but really captured my imagination, and a few years later formed the basis of a concert program called Pilgrim's Progress. At that point, 7 Times Salt had just formed. We were a group of graduate students at the Wanji School of Music, and this was one of our very first concerts. Fast forward then to 2018, and 7 Times Salt was fortunate enough to record the music at the historic 1717 Meeting House in West Barnstable, which some of you may be familiar with. It is an amazing building that's been used for meetings for over 300 years now. And so today you're going to hear excerpts from that album, Pilgrim's Progress, which includes music as well as spoken word in the form of fictitious journal entries that we wrote from the viewpoints of the settlers in order to flesh out the story and make it feel more personal. We play period instruments, which are modern replicas of 16th and 17th century instruments. So today you're going to hear the Renaissance violin and Renaissance flute, the lute, the viola da gamba, and voices singing and speaking in original pronunciation, or OP as it's called. I should mention before I forget that we have the CD Pilgrim's Progress is available for sale through the Alden House Historic Site, as well as our website, 7timessalt.com, and we'll be sure to share more information about that at the end. So, to the story. Most of us learned in school that the Pilgrims, as they were later called, sailed on the Mayflower in 1620, landed on Plymouth Rock, and had a Thanksgiving feast with the natives. But that's only partially true. The settlers didn't refer to themselves as the Pilgrims. The story of Plymouth Rock was only made up 120 years later, and while there was indeed a day of Thanksgiving, that word may not mean what you think it means. We'll find out more about that soon enough. There's a lot more to this story, and the story begins several decades earlier in an England that was a patchwork of very different beliefs and attitudes towards worship, and that sometimes saw violence as a result. By the 1590s, Queen Elizabeth I had managed a compromise between staunch Catholics, conforming Anglicans, and a variety of Protestants, including Puritans, Anabaptists, Sabbatarians, and the group that concerns our so-called Pilgrims, the Separatists. Separatists viewed the Church of England with suspicion, believing that it held on to rituals of the Catholic Church that weren't called for in the Bible, and they wanted to separate themselves from the Church and worship in their own way, which was illegal. Now, many of you are probably already aware, having attended other programs for the Alden House, that Separatists are not Puritans, not quite the same. And the secret lies in the terms for those two groups. Puritans also distrusted certain elements of the church, but wanted to purify the church from within while remaining part of the Church of England. Separatists wanted to go so far as to separate themselves from the church, which was not allowed. So Queen Elizabeth I was relatively lenient towards these various religious groups, but in 1603, when James VI of Scotland was crowned King of England and head of the church, he started persecuting these various religious sects that he viewed as a threat to the nation. Members of separatist congregations were fined, harassed, attacked, even imprisoned, and families began to fear for their lives. So later you'll hear more about a particular group of separatists from the village of Scrooby in northern England and their decision to flee to Holland. It's also worth remembering, though, that the separatists were only about half of the settlers who came to the New World in 1620. The rest of the colonists who sailed on Mayflower were a mix of people of different backgrounds, different faiths, many of them middle class, some of higher station, and a number of servants, all of whom simply wanted to advance their fortunes and profit from the wealth they thought was waiting for them in the Americas, but none of whom particularly cared about freedom of religion. To them, it was purely a business opportunity. William Bradford called these people strangers. I think it's also worth pointing out that what a lot of us learned, that the Pilgrims came to New England for religious freedom, isn't entirely true. They went to Holland for religious freedom, but Dan will tell you more about that in a few minutes. But first we have some music for you. To represent the separatists' very uneasy time in England in the early 1600s, we will listen to some of the 18th Psalm, this version from the whole book of Psalms, from 1592. Here's Psalm 18.
And from above the Lord sent down to fetch me from below, and plucked me out of waters great, that would me overflow, and me delivered from foes that would have made me thrall, yea, from such foes as were too strong for me to deal withal. The Lord therefore will me reward, as I have done aright, and to the cleanness of my hands, appearing in his sight. For thou dost save the simple folk in trouble when they lie, and dost bring down the countenance of them that look full high.
Psalms certainly were not the only music that a resident of London, or of Scrooby for that matter, would have known. Music making was often an activity enjoyed at home or at the pub with family and friends, and at the time many collections were published, this being the early years of the 17th century, for exactly that purpose. One type of music meant for home use was the consort lesson. Within the context of music at this point, a consort means a group of instruments, sometimes the same type or sometimes different sorts of instruments. So the consort lesson that we're referring to was meant for a group of 6 very specific instruments, which was unusual for the time. The 6 instruments were the violin or treble viol, the bass viol, the flute or recorder, and 3 plucked instruments, the lute, the cittern, and the bandora. This fairly unique grouping came to be known as the English consort. And so the consort lesson that I mentioned was a setting of a familiar song, maybe a dance tune, or sometimes a brand new composition that allowed these 6 musicians to play divisions. Divisions are ornamentations that divide the notes into smaller rhythmic values. So you hear smaller, faster notes inside the melody. This job of ornamenting most often fell to the lute, but sometimes the flute or the violin get to join in as well. And in the meantime, the bass viol and cittern and bandora just try to hold steady and keep everyone together. Consort lessons were popular among amateur musicians, but as you'll hear in just a moment, the virtuosic lute divisions were not meant for the faint of heart or technique. So we like to imagine Plymouth settler Edward Winslow, who was a man of good education and perhaps some musical training, we don't know, practicing his lute as a young man at the King's School in Worcester. So here is part of a piece called The Bachelor's Delight from Thomas Morley's first book of consort lessons that was published in 1599. Music wasn't only played at home, though. It was also a central part of the theater-going experience. And many wonderful examples are referenced in the plays of William Shakespeare, to take one example. Songs that look like a simple text printed on the page were in fact brought to life, sung and danced by the actors on stage. In performing songs from this period, Seven Times Salt usually tries to use original pronunciation, or OP, as I mentioned, to give the flavor of how the English language probably sounded around 1600. Scholars have now been researching this for decades, and as best they can tell, OP sounds sort of Irish, sort of American, a little bit Cockney, and I also hear bits of Cornwall and Devon and all the wonderful West Country accents that you still hear in the southwest of England today. What OP is not is the refined upper class sort of British accent that we might associate with classically trained actors performing Shakespeare, or that we might imitate while watching Downton Abbey or the latest season of The Crown. So in our next example, you'll hear Matt sing this next song using a little bit of the accent, which probably sounds more American than you might expect. One main feature of OP is that it keeps the R's that we have in American, unlike modern day British English. This slide, I can point out an example of something wonderful that happens when you sing or speak in OP. If you look at the first 2 lines of the song and look at the last word of each line, you see roaming and coming, which are close, but not exactly a rhyme in modern English. But with a few tweaks in OP, these words become roaming and coming, which rhyme very nicely. So that's just one example of what can happen, that suddenly words rhyme in OP that don't in modern English. And often puns start to work that don't work in modern English. So our next example is a song from William Shakespeare's play Twelfth Night that we imagine anyone might have heard in the taverns or theaters of London around the year 1605. This is O Mistress Mine.
O mistress mine, where are you roaming? O mistress mine, where are you roaming? Oh, stay and hear your true love's coming. Oh, stay and hear your true love's coming, that can sing both high and low. Trip no further, pretty sweeting, journeys end in lovers' meeting, every wise man's son doth know. What is love? 'Tis not hereafter. What is love? 'Tis not hereafter. Present mirth hath present laughter. Present mirth hath present laughter. What's to come is still unsure. In delay there lies no plenty. Then come kiss me, sweet and 20. Youth's a stuff 'twill not endure.
And now I get to talk about the part of the Plymouth journey that not as many people are familiar with, at least not in the United States. The decade that about half of the Plymouth colonists spent in the Netherlands before sailing for the New World. As Karen mentioned a bit earlier, it was a pretty tough time for religious dissenters in England, i.e. anybody who did not conform with the Anglican Church. And a congregation that was based in the town of Scrooby in Nottinghamshire, led by their pastor John Robinson, decided to flee England in 1607, bound for the religious freedom of the Netherlands. Unfortunately, King James had made it illegal for religious dissenters to leave England without permission from the crown, which was almost never granted, so they had to make a secret agreement with a merchant shipping captain to transport them to Holland. Unfortunately, that captain sold them out and delivered them instead to the authorities, who imprisoned several members of the congregation and seized all of their property and possessions. Despite the setback, though, about 30 members of the congregation tried again a year later, and this time they successfully made it to Amsterdam. By early 1609, they had obtained a government charter to rent some properties in the town of Leyden. Now, Leyden in this time in 1609 was a busy cosmopolitan town of about 45,000 people, which was a far cry from the little village of 200 people that the Scrooby immigrants were used to. Their neighborhood in Leyden was home to a dizzying array of different people: Catholics, Lutherans, Belgian Huguenots, Sephardic Jews, Ottoman Muslims, and many others. And while the Scrooby congregation didn't have the money or space to build a church, they were able to worship freely every Sunday in John Robinson's house, which became their church. Well, we don't know for sure what kind of music the separatists might have enjoyed while they were at home in Leyden. There's no doubt that it was a great place to find music in the early 1600s, especially printed music, because Leyden was quickly becoming the center of the Dutch printing industry at the time. When we researched the music that the Scrooby settlers might have heard while living in Holland, we generally ended up drawing from music published a few decades later, during the heyday of the Leyden publishing industry, including the very popular collection Toenemend Kabinet, or the Useful Collection, which was a book of instrumental music collected for enjoyment at home, specifically by amateur musicians. The pieces that we use in the Dutch section of our program come from a variety of sources. The piece that we're about to play actually was first published as a dance tune, a couranto, by Michael Pretorius in Germany, in southern Germany, in the early 1600s, and very shortly became adapted to a Dutch Christmas carol that is still popular today, O herders let uw boksken schapen, O Shepherds, Leave Your Goats and Sheep. And it's a very fun, you can hear how it's a dance tune, and it requires a nimble tongue on the part of the singer to get all the words out when it's sung as a Christmas piece. So here's a little bit of the instrumental version of that Coranto. And you probably noticed, those of you who might be familiar with early music instruments, that we featured a couple of recorders playing the top couple of lines in that piece. And most of you probably think of the recorder as a school instrument that kids learn how to play before moving on to more serious instruments. But in the Renaissance and Baroque eras, certainly in the era that when the separatists were living in Leiden, the recorder was a serious instrument, and it came in many sizes, from the tiny sopranino to the 7-foot-tall contrabass. It was frequently played by both amateurs and virtuosic professionals. One of these professionals was a man named Jacob van Eyck, who was a blind organist and recorder player from the town of Houston. As music director at the Janskerk in Utrecht, where he served for most of his life, he was paid an extra stipend on top of his organist's fees to sit in the church gardens in the evening and play his handfluit, which is the size of recorder that we now call a soprano, similar to the one that you might have played in school. And his repertoire consisted of popular songs, psalm tunes, and other melodies that would have been familiar to his listeners. And much like a modern jazz saxophonist, he was well known for creating virtuosic improvisations on these basic songs. Eventually, one of his students wrote down some of his improvisations, and they were published in the 1640s as the collection Der Flautenlusthof, or the Flute's Pleasure Garden. One of the more interesting holiday-themed pieces in this collection, which you see a brief excerpt from here on your screen now, is called O Heilig Zalig Bethlehem, or O Holy Blessed Bethlehem. And 400 years later, this remains one of the most popular Christmas songs in the Netherlands and Belgium. It even has the unique distinction of being equally beloved among both Catholics and Protestants, which is pretty rare in the Low Countries. So here's the tune and Van Eyck's first variation on it. For a more mellow sound, I actually play it here on the bass recorder rather than the more typical soprano. And for those of you who might like to hear the complete piece, we featured it recently in our annual Christmas holiday solstice concert, which you can find on our YouTube channel if you visit us on YouTube. And I was lucky enough to be able to record that wonderful piece in the beautiful and acoustically flawless surroundings of the Cathedral of the Holy Cross in Boston. So that was a very special experience. But back to Leiden. Although Leiden allowed the English immigrants to practice their religion free from retaliation, by about 1618, many in the Scrooby community started to worry that maybe Holland wasn't the best place for them after all. Dutch law allowed foreigners only a limited range of jobs, most of which were unskilled or low-skilled manual labor, and the majority of the Scrooby men worked in textile mills, tanneries, and other factory operations, and this was a very far cry from their training as Nottinghamshire farmers. And in the old story of immigrant populations everywhere, the English began to be concerned that their cultural identity was being lost. Their children were growing up speaking Dutch, some members of the group had married foreigners, and ironically enough, even though Dutch liberalism facilitated their religious freedom, they often looked down on the Dutch as being too liberal in their dress and manners. There was also legitimate concern that after the expiration of a 15-year truce that had been signed in 1609, the long Dutch War of Independence against the Spanish would resume. The worries in case of the war resuming ranged from the collapse of the economy to the ultimate fear, which would be the reconquest of Holland by Spain, leaving Protestants like the Scrooby congregation to the tender mercies of the Inquisition. So to avoid this, they decided to appeal to the London Corporation and sank almost all their meager savings into hiring 2 ships destined for the New World, which you'll hear more about in a moment. In the end, only 35 members of the congregation were able to depart for New England, with the rest staying behind in the hopes of eventually being able to raise enough money to join their friends and family. Some of them, like their pastor John Robinson himself, never made it to the New World, and many of their descendants live in Leiden to this day. On the day of the Pilgrim's departure for the New World, Robinson held a long and emotional church service in his home, and this also served as a final chance for the community to bid farewell to family members and friends that they might never see again. So while we were researching music in the Netherlands during this era, we found a theater song written in the 16-teens by the Dutch poet and playwright Brederel, "Doet op mijn liefje op de rij," or "Now My Love's Leaving on the Waves." And while it's unlikely that any in the congregation were familiar with this song, since the separatists were not generally theater goers, we can imagine that they would have empathized with the story of emigration that's portrayed in this ballad. Here is a short excerpt from this much longer ballad.
Musik, det alles kunst, die door die lyd sein liv kon dragen. Ik zal geleiden met mijn gunst, mijn waarste lief, mijn welbehagen. Waar ik ontslagend van het lot zich vlees, drache mijn geest trok met u op de reis. Nu doet het mijn gepijs.
And with that, we bid the Netherlands farewell. Here is a photo of the Mayflower 2, a replica of the original Mayflower that probably many of you are familiar with, have visited or seen. This photo was taken just this past August on the way back to Plymouth after the 2-year restoration project that got it looking just lovely, if you ask me. But the original Mayflower was supposed to have set off from Southampton in England in July 1620. And it was supposed to complete the crossing and arrive by early October. A transatlantic journey in 1620 would have been a challenge even under the best of circumstances, but the Mayflower was further burdened by delays, overcrowding, and under-provisioning. Why, we may ask? Well, as Dan mentioned, there was supposed to have been a second ship. A smaller ship, the Speedwell, transported those from the Leiden congregation to Southampton to join up with the Mayflower to make the crossing. But the poor Speedwell sprang a leak not once, not twice, but 3 separate times. And after turning back 3 times for repairs, by that point it was early September. And despairing of ever actually setting off, the Leiden group decided to abandon the Speedwell and join up with those aboard the Mayflower. Now, the Mayflower is a large ship, but it's not that large a ship. And we also have to remember it's a cargo ship, not a passenger ship. So they had planned that the Mayflower would carry about 65 people, as well as the crew, along with all of their provisions. With those from the Speedwell joining, it meant there were now over 100 passengers on board, along with the crew, and all of their belongings and farm equipment and seed and animals and feed for the animals, just everything you can possibly imagine, crammed into the hold of the Mayflower. And there was very little privacy, and as we'll hear, it was quite a crossing, as many of you probably already know. So let's see, they set off in September, at which point the autumn storms in the northern Atlantic were just beginning, which made for a very difficult crossing and meant that they finally arrived at Cape Cod in November. And after some weeks of scouting, they sailed across Cape Cod Bay to a place the natives called Patuxet, and arriving in early December. The English would later call the place Plymouth. At that point, it was months too late to begin planting, so clearly provisions and housing were going to be an issue. But a quick anecdote, real quick, since we promised you some Christmas-themed items. William Bradford actually mentions Christmas Day 1620 shortly after they had landed, although not for the reason you might suspect. He wrote about it not as a holiday, but as a workday. And he says, "On the 25th day, they began to erect the first house for common use to receive them and their goods." Now, it may seem odd to us to be working on Christmas Day, but I'll explain more about this in just a moment, and we'll hear why Christmas Day was not a holiday for the separatists and how it caused some dissent the following year. With the onset of winter storms at that point and unable to complete enough dwellings for everyone, the passengers ended up spending another 3 months aboard the Mayflower. The overcrowded ship stayed there in Plymouth Harbor, and during this time, 45 out of the 102 passengers died from illness. The passengers finally came ashore and started to build houses in March of 1621, 8 months after they had left England. While there are indeed rocks on the shore, I just want to throw this in real quick. The story of Plymouth Rock as a historic landing site was told by a somewhat dramatic descendant in the 18th century, and it's possible that he believed that one specific rock was where his ancestors had come ashore, but there's really no way to know. And obviously things at that time were very difficult, and on our CD, we try to portray the gravity of their situation in some of the spoken diary entries that I mentioned. But musically, we actually headed in the opposite direction and tried to bring a little bit of levity with some tunes about sailing and the sea. So one of these tunes that we'll hear next is from a collection called Deuteromelia, published by Thomas Ravenscroft in 1609, just as the Scrooby congregation would have been settling into life in Holland. But we'll welcome the new shore and hear "We Be Three Poor Mariners."
We be 3 poor mariners, newly come from the seas. We spend our lives in jeopardy, whilst others live at ease. Shall we go dance the round, the round, the round? And shall we go dance the round, the round, the round? And he that is a bully boy, come pledge me on the ground, the ground, the ground. We care not for those martial men that do our estates disdain, but we care for those mariners merchantmen which do our estates maintain. To them we dance this round around the round, and to them we dance this round around the round. And hey, that is a bully boy, come pledge me on the ground, the ground, the ground.
The colonists didn't actually call their harvest celebration in the fall of 1621 a Thanksgiving. They had had the good fortune of encountering Wampanoag natives who were friendly and some of whom even spoke English, who were willing to help and make alliances and, yes, celebrate a first harvest with them. But that harvest feast most likely took place in September when the harvest comes in, not in late November, which is usually quite cold and not good for harvesting very much, at least not in New England. By contrast, at the time, a day of Thanksgiving was a day of fasting and giving thanks to God, which they did a number of times, perhaps most notably in the summer of 1623 at the end of a long drought and the welcome arrival of a ship with supplies. But the holiday that we now call Thanksgiving only came to be celebrated in November during the Civil War under President Lincoln. These early peace treaties with local tribes helped to ensure Plymouth's safety and were a source of revenue because of fur trading that allowed them to pay their debts back to the Merchant Adventurers Corporation, which had funded the colony. We have to remember that these settlers were in debt before they ever left England. Over the next several years, more people came, some from the congregation back in Leiden, which reunited some families, but certainly not all, and others came from England, though not necessarily more separatists. And by 1630, the colony numbered roughly 300 people. We know about 3 music books that were listed in a 1644 inventory of William Brewster's possessions. One was a copy of Henry Ainsworth's Psalter, which you see here on the left. Psalter is a small book of psalm texts, usually without tunes, but Ainsworth did have the psalm tunes, one of which you see here. That Psalter had been published in Holland in 1612, specifically for separatist congregations living there at the time. The second book was the Psalms of David, also in musical settings, this one for voices and instruments, set by Richard Allison. And the third book was The Golden Garland, a collection of broadside ballads or songs meant to be sung to popular tunes of the time. So we think it's probably very likely that the English settlers would have known this next piece that we'll listen to, the 100th Psalm. And we're going to hear it in 2 versions, both of which you see here on your screen. On the left is the tune from the Ainsworth Psalter, which we sing in unison like the separatists did in worship. They didn't sing in harmony, just the unison tune. And we'll follow that with 2 more verses in the 4-part harmony you see on the right. That's a setting by John Dowland from a very similar time period. So maybe that represents the Anglicans among the group. Here's the 100th Psalm.
Shout to Jehovah on the earth, serve ye Jehovah with gladness, before him come with singing mirth. Know that Jehovah he good is. 'Tis he that made us and not we, his flock and sheep of his feeding. Oh, with confession enter ye, his gates, his courtyards with praising. Confess to him, bless ye his name, because Jehovah he good is. His mercy ever is the same, and his faith unto all ages.
Along with their psalm singing, we might tend to think of the Pilgrims as a dour lot, but it's not true. We have to remember they weren't Puritans. And even that stereotype that we think of the Puritan wearing somber black with buckled shoes who shuns dancing, drinking, and all forms of fun also is not entirely accurate, and it belongs to a different group of people in a later decade. We should also remember, as I mentioned, that the separatists were only half the people, roughly, who sailed on the Mayflower. The rest were Church of England or Dutch Reformed, some were devout, some not at all, and everyone was used to various forms of recreation wherever they had happened to come from. So while it's true worship did last all day on Sundays, and everyone, separatist or not, was required to attend, and although their work as farmers and fishermen must have been exhausting, they certainly found time to sing or whistle, sport, and even dance on occasion, although co-ed dancing was not allowed. Going back to my mention of Christmas 1620, we finally get to some explanation. Along with their other beliefs, the separatists rejected most of the church sacraments that weren't described in the Bible. For example, they considered marriage to be a civil affair to be handled by the state, not a religious affair. And while they did observe the Sabbath, they did not recognize what to many of us are very traditional Christian holidays, such as Easter and Christmas, because they weren't described in the Bible. Their pastor back in Leiden, John Robinson, wrote, "It seems too much for any mortal man to appoint or make an anniversary memorial." In other words, if the Bible hadn't spelled it out, it wasn't up to mankind to decide to celebrate it or to assign a date to it. I love this next slide that Dan found for our presentation today. In the middle, you see Father Christmas saying, "Oh, sir, I bring good cheer." And on the left, we have our, who knows, separatist or Puritan or someone who disagrees with the Church of England saying, "Keep out, you," oh, what does it say? "Keep out, you may not come here."
Keep out, you come not here.
You come not here. So we won't have Christmas here. And then on the right, we have someone who does appreciate Christmas. "Old Christmas welcome, do not fear." And in fact, a little bit of this actually happened the following year, 1621. I like the story that Bradford tells that really illustrates the difference between separatists and strangers in regards to holidays. So the previous month, November 1621, a ship had arrived unexpectedly with 35 new settlers, most of whom were young men, who managed to show up very badly provisioned, without much bedding, with no extra food, and no winter clothes. So Bradford wrote the following anecdote about these young men, and you'll hear me mention the governor. He was the governor, so he's mentioning himself in the third person, which I also think is kind of funny. So he wrote, "On the day called Christmas Day, the governor called them out to work. But most of this new company excused themselves and said it went against their consciences to work on that day. So the governor told them that if they made it a matter of conscience, he would spare them till they were better informed. So he led away the rest and left them. But when they came home at noon from their work, he found them in the street at play openly, some pitching the bar and some playing at stool ball and such like sports. So he went to them and took away their implements and told them that was against his conscience and that they should play in others' work. If they made the keeping of it a matter of devotion, let them keep it to their houses, but there should be no gaming or revelling in the streets. Since which time nothing hath been attempted that way, at least openly." This story just makes me laugh because Bradford went and took their toys away on Christmas Day. Of course, it was a much more serious matter in his mind, but it's still amusing to read. So our next song, we can imagine, represents both sides of this Christmas disagreement. You'll hear part of the song, "The Little Barleycorn," that describes the many merits of drinking Christmas beer, along with the English country dance tune, "Bobbing Joe," which is an excellent dance for keeping warm on a cold day with or without a beverage. Here is "The Little Barleycorn."
Come and do not musing stand, if thou the truth discern, but take a full cup in thy hand, and thus begin to learn, not of the earth, nor of the air, at evening or at morn, But jovial boys, your Christmas keep with a little barley corn. It is the neatest serving man to entertain a friend. It will do more than money can, all jarring suits to mend. There's life in it, and it is here, 'tis here within this car. Then take your liquor, do not spare, but clear, carouse it. There's life in it, and it is here, 'tis here within this car. Then take your liquor, do not spare, but clear, carouse it.
So, to present a slightly alternative viewpoint to the viewpoint of the separatists and the good Pilgrim fathers governing Plymouth, one of our greatest discoveries while putting this program together was the book New English Canaan by a man named Thomas Morton. This is definitely not a book you would have heard about while learning the story of the first Thanksgiving in school. A very colorful character, as you'll hear more about in a moment, Morton allowed us to look at the Pilgrims in a new light, since he wrote about them from an outsider's perspective, and he wasn't at all hesitant to criticize what he saw as their mistakes or their exaggerated sense of self-importance. Morton came to New England a few years after the Plymouth colonists in 1624, and along with Richard Wollaston, an English sea captain whose name will sound familiar to everybody, I'm sure, he started a small trading colony on the site of what we now know as Quincy, Massachusetts. Although the colony was originally set up by the men as Mount Wollaston, named after Captain Wollaston, Morton, who was an abolitionist before it was fashionable, became furious when he found out that Wollaston had been facilitating the transfer of slaves through Mount Wollaston to tobacco plantations in Virginia, and he encouraged the residents of the colony to rise up and become a self-governing community. He was a charismatic leader, and they did just that. Richard Wollaston eventually fled to Virginia with a few of his supporters in 1626, and Morton and the remaining residents renamed their colony Merriment. Unlike the Plymouth colonists, he traded freely with the native Massachusetts tribe, including supplying them with liquor, and encouraged members of the Merriment settlement to intermarry with the Native Americans. With an opinion on holidays that was almost the polar opposite of the Pilgrim Fathers at Plymouth, he and his fellow colonists also encouraged and enjoyed revelry of all kinds and every holiday that they could conceive of celebrating. As a native of the West Country in England, he was fond of many of the old pagan agrarian celebrations, including the tradition of the maypole. And in New English Canaan, he writes about one particular celebration where a maypole 80 feet tall was erected, and English and Native Americans alike feasted and reveled together. Along with the eating and drinking, Morton says, "There was likewise a merry song made, which, to make their revels more fashionable, was sung with a chorus, every man bearing his part, which they performed in a dance, hand in hand about the maypole, whiles one of the company sung and filled out the good liquor, like Gamedes and Jupiter." The words of this song, which Morton probably wrote himself, delighted us so much and worked as such a perfect counterpoint to the sometimes relentless piety of Bradford and Company that we knew we had to include it in the concert. Our lutenist Matt Wright wrote a tune for it, and we quickly arranged it as a rowdy Morris dance coom drinking song for the ensemble. So here it is. We like to imagine it accompanying a great deal of enthusiastic co-ed dancing. This is Drink and Be Merry by Thomas Morton.
Then drink and be merry, merry boys, let all delight in Imon's joys. To Imon now the day is come, about the merry maple take a run. Make green garlands, bring bottles out, and fill sweet nectar freely about. Uncover thy head, and fear no harm, for here's good liquor, keep it warm. Then drink and be merry, merry boys, let all delight in Imon's joys. To Imon now is the thing assigned by the deity's own mind to cure the heart oppressed with grief, and of good liquors is the chief.
Then drink and be merry, merry boys, they all delight in Hyman's joys. To Hyman now the day is come, about the merry maid we'll take our own.
Give to the melancholy man a cup or two off now and then. This physic will soon revive his blood and make him be of merrier mood.
Then drink and be merry, merry boys, they all delight in Hyman's joys. To Hyman now the day is come, about the merry maid we'll take our own.
Give to the nymph that's free from scorn no Irish stuff nor Scotch or wine. Lasses in beaver coats come away. You're welcome to us night and day.
And drink and be merry, merry boys, let all delight in Hyman's joys. To Hyman now the day is come, about the merry maid we'll make a round. And drink and be merry, merry boys, let all delight in Hyman's joys. To Hyman now the day is come, about the merry maid we'll take a round.
Well, on that very of musical note, we've come almost to the end of our presentation today. Plymouth continued to face economic hardship in its first decade, but after the deaths of that first winter, the colonists remained relatively healthy. In the 1630s, Plymouth established a lucrative cattle trade with the Massachusetts Bay Colony to the north. That's where the Puritans were. Agriculture did fairly well, and they sent fish and furs back to England and slowly started to pay off their debts. William Bradford's Chronicle of Plymouth Plantation ends in 1650, as does our concert program. And before we move to some questions, I just want to thank Alden House Historic Site and Desiree for having us today. And I also want to give a shout out to our band members, Matthew Wright and Josh Schreiber-Shellem, who's playing and singing you heard earlier. I also just want to mention again that our CD, Pilgrim's Progress, is available through Alden House and also on our website, along with all of our other CDs and links to various videos, including the solstice video that I saw someone was asking about in the chat. And our website is 7timessalt.com. I'll put that in the chat again. Just before we move to some questions, I do want to add that our particular focus on 17th century English music is certainly not meant to ignore the others involved in this story. I think we all know that relations between the native peoples and European settlers have a very long and complex history, and I encourage all of us to read more and learn more about native history, both past and present day, and make sure that their story is also heard. We'd love to hear from you in any case, so feel free to get in touch through our website, and I think now we will move on to some questions. Desiree, do we have any?
We certainly do. Oh, that was absolutely delightful, and especially hearing some of those pieces on the older instruments. So I'm going to just start at the beginning, and this first question is from Greg. And again, it sort of relates back to the first part of the presentation, and he wanted to know if this is where the origins of our modern concerts got started.
You want to take it, Dan?
Sure. I mean, the concept of concerts, of course, goes back much further than the 17th century. But the concept of concerts that we have today, where it's something that, where anybody can enjoy a musical performance for the price of a ticket, is a much more recent thing. Concerts, specific presentations of music for an audience in the 17th century would have been mostly private affairs. They would have occurred at court and in the private houses of wealthy people. As we moved into the 18th century, they started opening public theaters and that sort of thing, but what it cost to attend, either in required social prestige or money, still made them mostly the domain of the wealthier upper echelons of society. It wasn't until the 19th century that we saw more of a democratization of the concert process, where large concert halls such as the type that we're used to now were built, and where concert performances became affordable enough that the average person could afford to buy a ticket. So that is a relatively recent recent phenomenon, the idea of a large concert hall where anybody can pay a relatively affordable ticket price and go hear a concert. It was much more rarefied for a much smaller audience in centuries past.
Thank you.
And also tying in, I do think we can tie in the theater experience that I mentioned, that, I think most of us today tend to think of a play as a separate thing from a musical, right? Maybe sometimes a play has some music, or maybe a musical has dialogue, but back then, I was referencing the plays of Shakespeare. All of those songs were sung and performed. There were singers and instrumentalists, so, I think that maybe filled the social want for a concert. Even though you were attending a play, you were going to get to hear some music as well.
So Susan has a few questions that she wanted to ask you all, and that is, first one is very specific about your slides, and that is, whose photo is on the slide of music in the New World? It's number 13.
Meaning who took the photo, or who the interpreters are?
Whose photo is, let's see, on the slide, so I would say who they are.
I think it's the frontispiece of the New English Canon, correct? Is that what we're looking at? New English Canon?
Yeah, I think so. Number 13.
Yeah, that's Thomas Morton, who we were talking about. That's his picture. Yep. Yeah,
in his 80-foot maypole.
Yes, exactly.
And did the Pilgrims have many confrontations with those who wanted to celebrate more freely? And Susan, are you referring to Christmas in general? Or, because I know they actually even outlawed it at one point.
Yeah, Christmas was outlawed in Massachusetts for a number of decades. I don't remember the specific years, but a large part of the 17th century. But also what Dan mentioned, Dan, maybe you want to talk more about Morton and his interactions. We're not always peaceable with the Flamettists.
No, they were not. Actually, Bradford was very unhappy with Morton's rebels and sent, we often hear the story of Miles Standish as being this, sort of heroic figure. And in fact, he was kind of a thug. He was basically Bradford's enforcer. And at one point, he sent Standish, along with about 30 armed men, up to Merriment to capture Morton by force and put him in shackles and put him on a boat back for England, which they did. He eventually returned years later and ended up in what today is Maine, resettled up there. But they actually forcibly removed him from his own colony and threw him on a ship back for England because they were so scandalized by what he was doing in his colony. There could have been also, I think, maybe a little bit of less religious envy going on there, because Merriment at the time, we're talking now in the early 1620s, was much more successful commercially than Plymouth was, because he and Wollaston had set it up primarily as a trading colony, and they really focused on trading furs primarily, also fish, that sort of thing. And it was much more of a business than the Plymouth colony was in the early years, and so they were more successful financially.
So a question about what they brought over on the Mayflower. So any evidence of any instruments? You mentioned Brewster's books, but is there anything known about what kind of instruments they might have had and how they acquired them in the early years?
Yes and no. We know they had at least a trumpet and a drum, because Bradford mentions in his writings about I forget which event it was, but processing down the middle of the village at one point with a trumpet and a drum. So we know they had at least that. I want to say there's also, I always mix this story up. I want to say there's mention of a bass viol, but that might not be the Mayflower. It might have been one of the other early ships. Dan, do you remember?
Yeah, there was in the Massachusetts Bay Colony, one of the ships that went there were actually multiple viols, but I think I remember the manifest of the Mayflower, there was a bass viol. There was no indication of who it belonged to.
Yeah, other than that, it's just conjecture. And while on the one hand, it could seem frustrating not to have that information, on the other hand, it allowed us more creativity in putting this program together, because we could imagine, okay, well, maybe someone knew this song from their childhood, or maybe someone had heard that psalm, and just sort of piece together a more satisfying concert program in that respect.
So Tom asks if there were any prohibitions or rules that the Pilgrims had concerning women singing with men or in public. You mentioned something about that early on in your program. Also, when did part singing begin in the colony?
Well, for the first part of that question, I don't know any prohibitions about singing together. I know that the co-ed dancing was definitely a no-no. I mean, that's something I learned about when I was an interpreter there. But as far as I know, for example, singing the Psalms in church or singing a catch with someone else working in the cornfield, I think it was fine, but I'm not a scholar in that regard, so I'm not sure. And I'm sorry, what was the second part of the question?
Oh, when did part singing begin in the colony?
I don't know. Dan, do you have any?
I mean, probably right away. As Karen mentioned, not everybody, the separatists did not believe in singing in parts in their worship services, but they certainly would have heard part songs. I mean, anybody who was from England, they had been singing polyphonic, that is multi-part music, for 300 years at that point. And so they were well used to it. The fact that it wasn't allowed in worship, I think, was incidental to whether or not people knew about it. At the time they showed up, there were several collections published, like Deuteramelia that Karen mentioned earlier, that were specifically for multi-part songs. Some of them were simple rounds or catches, and some of them were a little bit more complicated, but they would actually say, for instance, in Deuteramelia, Ravenscroft, the publisher, says, a song of 3 voices or a song of 5 voices. And I think, Karen, what's the max in Deuteramelia? It's 6, right? The biggest in there is for 6 voices.
So I don't know if it's Deuteramelia specifically, but Ravenscroft published a trio of books, Amelia, Deuteramelia, and I'm going to blank on the third one. One of them actually has a round for 11 voices.
Oh, does it? Okay. Yeah.
And it's kind of a funny piece because each part is really short, but you get to stack up 11 voices on top of each other. But by and large, like Dan said, most of them are for 3, 4, 5 parts. And I should also mention that a lot of those songs that Ravenscroft collected and published, or possibly wrote some of them, a lot of them are also very easy. There are, like, we would learn row, row, row your boat today. You don't have to be able to read music. And that's why those collections were so interesting to us, because a large number of the settlers couldn't read words, that is. We have to assume that if they couldn't read words, they probably hadn't been taught to read music either. So Ravenscroft is great because anybody can sing it. You just sing the way that it goes. And then once you have all the voices in, suddenly you're singing a song with a lot of different parts, which is a lot of fun.
Yeah, and that's how most people learned, even back in England at that point. The idea of performing from written music, reading music off a page to perform, was pretty much limited to professional church musicians in the Church of England at that time. The only people who would have had that skill would have been professional church musicians, or I shouldn't say just professional church musicians, because there were some wealthy, noble amateurs who could do it because they had the time and the financial resources to learn how to do something as sort of impractical as learning how to read music off a page. But most people at that point were learning by ear.
So another question from Diana, how did the Plymouth settlers, or did they do any kind of rehearsal of music for religious services? And would they have used lining of psalms, or is this undocumented?
Again, it's where we sort of have to apply our experience as human beings to something that we don't have written evidence of. I kind of have to think, since music performance in church wasn't a thing. I mean, you didn't go in order to hear pretty music. You went to sing psalms to praise the Lord, right? That doesn't really call for rehearsal in my mind. You learn the psalm, you sing it, it's part of your worship. It's not meant to so much be a beautiful thing like you would go to hear in a concert, I think. I don't know, Dan, what do you?
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right. I don't think there was any sort of, I can't imagine they would have rehearsed for any sort of, certainly not for anything used in worship. Again, people would have had to learn the psalm tunes, and most people learned them by ear. So it's possible that, maybe in the house, you might have parents singing the psalms to their children or something like that in order to teach them the tunes so they could sing them in church, but not for any sort of like a public performance, I don't think.
Several questions about some of your programs. Again, I think we've put your website up there for which has all of their CDs and upcoming events, I believe.
Yep, and I will put it again just in case.
Yep, and I also want to just remind you all again that Dan and Karen and the members of 7 Times Salt have very generously allowed us to record this program so that we'll be able to post it on Facebook and on the Alden website. And so you can share it again. So I think another question was about, and you had touched on this briefly, music from the Wampanoags. Do you have anything in your collection, or do you play any of that on your CDs?
Dan, do you want to?
Yeah. I mean, we don't, unfortunately. This is, to me, I grew up in the Pacific Northwest, in Washington State, and I grew up, in fact, just a few miles from a reservation, and grew up going to powwows and that sort of thing. And it was really a bit of a shock to me when I moved out here to New England how little Native American culture there was. But I know that Karen knows the Wampanoag reenactors that are involved with Plymouth, and they are all Wampanoag tribal members. And some of them, I think, are still involved in, active musical traditions. All of the Native American musical traditions, again, are not based in written music. It's an oral tradition. They learn to play and to sing by ear. Everything is taught by ear. A great resource for that, and I'll put his name in the chat as well, is a gentleman named Hawk Henrys, who lives up in southern Maine. He's a Nipmuc tribal member, and he makes traditional Native American cedar flutes. I've played some of his instruments, and they're really wonderful. Again, I don't claim to know anything about the tradition of playing Native American flutes, but I've tried the instrument, and he makes wonderful instruments, and he's very conversant in modern traditions, at least in the Nipmuc tribe, and I think others in the New England area of music. So he's a good resource for that. But it's not something we would presume to do. None of us have the background for it. And
right. I mean, our training at the Laundry School is specifically in European early music, and this group formed to play even more specifically English 17th century music. So that's not to say that we're not interested. We are interested, but our expertise and training is in the English side of things, which is how we can present all this music for you all today.
Well, I think we should probably start to wrap this up. We told everyone it would be an hour, and we're just over that because it was just so wonderful. Again, what a delightful way to spend Boxing Day, if you remember that from the English tradition, and certainly this holiday season. So I want to thank you all again for joining us today. We're absolutely thrilled to bring you this program and to share with you the music of 7 Times Salt. We encourage you to help support our mission to preserve Alden House Historic Site by making a donation to our annual fund. If you visit alden.org, you can also learn a lot more about the Alden family, Pilgrim history, and how you can participate in sharing this legacy. So from Alden House to yours, we want to send our very best wishes to you for a healthy and prosperous new year. We look forward to seeing everybody in 2021. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Right.
Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you again, Dan and Karen, and Happy New Year.
Happy New Year.
Bye-bye.